The desert turned everything gold at dusk, and Harry had been watching it long enough to know the gold was a trick. It lasted about 12 minutes. He had timed it over 3 weeks, before the sky went purple and the purple went black, and you were left with stars and the particular silence of an enormous amount of nothing being very far in every direction. He was counting them. He had counted them the night before and gotten to 47 before Bill called him in, and tonight he was trying to beat his own record, which was a pointless goal because the stars did not move and 47 was not close to the whole sky. Still, it was something to do with his hands that was not touching his scar. He was sitting on a flat stone at the edge of the camp, 3 canvas tents, a fire pit, a collection of equipment. Bill called the kit, in a tone that suggested Harry should not touch any of it. The stone under him was warm even now, bleeding heat from a day of full sun, and the air smelled like dust and something mineral and old. In his pocket was a piece of pale yellow limestone about the size of his fist, smooth on one side and rough on the other, that Bill had let him keep from last week's survey. Bill had said it came from an outer passage wall, which meant it was 3,000 years old. Harry had been turning this over in his mind, along with the stone every evening since 3,000 years. Someone had cut this stone and set it in a wall when the tallest building in England was whatever a person could stack before it fell. And now Harry Potter was sitting in Egypt holding it, and Aunt Petunia's kitchen with its floral curtains. He was not entirely sure he believed in wizards. He believed in Egypt. Egypt was very difficult to argue with. Bill came out of the big tent with 2 bowls and his usual evening expression, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He handed Harry a bowl, rice with cumin and what might have been chickpeas, and definitely also some amount of sand, and folded himself down onto the flat stone with a grunt that sounded older than 19. 23, fewer than yesterday. I started later. Bill ate, Harry ate. The fire crackled between the tents, and in the dark beyond it something moved across the sand, a bird or a fox or a shadow, and then was gone, absorbed back the way the desert absorbed everything. Eventually Mum wrote again, Bill said. He was looking at the horizon. She asks how you are. I told her you're well. Am I well? You're eating, you're not up all night. A pause. You haven't accidentally set anything on fire. That was one time, Harry said, twice. The tent flap was the first time. I'm including the tent flap. Harry did not argue. He turned the limestone in his fingers and thought about the things he thought about every evening when there was too much sky and not enough to fill it. He had been in the cupboard when it happened. He spent quite a lot of time in the cupboard, which was small and smelled of cleaning products but was his in the narrow way that small things become yours when you have nothing wider to claim. He'd been there on an ordinary Tuesday when he heard the knock, the second knock which had patience in it, and then his aunt's voice going careful and tight, and then another voice underneath hers, low, unhurried, with a quality like a very large room. The man had been tall. Half-moon spectacles and silver hair past his shoulders, and a beard that reached his chest, and a robe the color of the inside of an aubergine. He'd looked at Harry with an expression that was not pity and not surprise, which was unusual, because most adults who found Harry in the cupboard had at least one of those things on their face. This man looked at him as if he had expected exactly this, and found it confirmed something he had been thinking about for a long time. He'd said, "My name is Albus Dumbledore. I believe you have had a great many years of being confused. We will address some of that if you're willing." Harry had been willing. He hadn't had much practice in being asked. What Dumbledore explained, standing in the hallway, while Aunt Petunia went very still against the kitchen door frame. Harry was a wizard. His parents had been wizards, and they were dead, but not the way he had been told. there had been a man not yet named. Dumbledore said, "Not yet," with a deliberateness that Harry filed away, and Lily Potter had done something extraordinary. He would go, eventually, to a school. For now he would go to Egypt, with a young man called Bill Weasley, who would be responsible for him. "Your registration will remain at this address. Legally and magically, this is still your home." Harry had thought about the word home and how it fit, and it hadn't quite fit the way Dumbledore seemed to mean it. But the man's eyes were steady and kind, and Harry was 9, and he had decided to believe him provisionally. 3 days later, Bill had arrived, red hair, earring, coat with 12 pockets, and shaken Harry's hand like Harry was someone worth a proper handshake, and said, "Right, Egypt? Have you got anything to bring?" Harry had the pillowcase, with 3 things in it. Bill had not commented. The portkey had felt like being turned inside out by someone who found the process routine, and then the air was warm and heavy and enormous, and the light was white rather than yellow, and everything smelled like stone and time. Harry had stood in the middle of it with his pillowcase and thought, as clearly as he had ever thought anything, "This is better." He was still mostly thinking it. The letter moved. Bill's letter from his mother had been sitting on the stone between them, weighted at the corner with a pebble. A gust came off the desert, and the pebble was not enough, and the letter rose 3 inches into the air and began to drift sideways. Then it reversed. Against the wind, not with it, it curved in a gentle arc and settled back into Bill's open hand. As though completing a thought, they both looked at it. Bill turned it over once in his fingers. "That keeps happening, doesn't it?" he said. "Not quite a question. It always has," Harry said. Bill folded the letter along its original creases and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat, 3rd from the left. He looked out at the desert, which had gone fully dark while they sat, and the stars overhead were pressing through fast, too many to count in any reasonable amount of time, and Harry had long since lost his place among them. "Next week," Bill said after a while, "we've been assigned a new site, a pyramid complex, not yet surveyed by Gringotts." He set his bowl down. He did not look at Harry when he said the next part. "You'll be staying at camp." Harry held the limestone in both hands, rough side against one palm, smooth side against the other. "All right," he said. The fire ate the air quietly, and the silence beyond it was the big kind, the desert kind, the kind you could put anything into and it would not be full. Harry was 9 years old. He had a piece of very old stone, and no wand, and a list of things he was not ready to say aloud. Somewhere behind him, in the direction that was England and Surrey and school terms, a house sat on a quiet street with his name on the registration. He did not think about it much. He thought about pyramid walls. He thought about the thing that kept lifting letters into the warm Egyptian dark and returning them gently to where they belonged. He thought, next week. The survey notes for the pyramid complex were 47 pages long, and Bill had read them 3 times, and they were still wrong in at least 2 places he could identify. He had made notes in the margins in a handwriting that started neat and went progressively more pointed across the page, because the survey had been conducted by a team from the Prague office who had clearly never worked Egyptian sites before, and had, in their collective professional opinion, that was the kind of mistake that got people's heads to grow. That was not a figure of speech. Bill had seen it once. He did not intend to see it again. He set the notes aside and stretched, pulling his hair back with the practiced motion of long habit. The fang earring caught the early light. Outside, the sun was already up and already committed, and the camp was quiet, in the way of early hours before the insects started and the air began to move. He poured water from the clay jug, cool, still, barely, and drank it standing and thought about the goblin field supervisor. The goblin field supervisor's name, Bill, had not yet learned to pronounce correctly. He had tried 4 times. The supervisor had not corrected him, which meant either that Bill was getting closer or that the goblin had entirely given up, and in 2 months on site he had not been able to determine which. The most recent note, 3rd in a fortnight, had said, in the terse way goblins had with writing, that artifact retrieval was expected to begin within the week per the agreed schedule, and that delays of a personal nature were not recognized by Gringotts as delays at all. The personal nature referred to Harry. Bill folded the note into a very small square and put it in the pocket of his coat between a lighter he couldn't remember packing and a ward-mapping tool he'd borrowed from Marcus and been meaning to return. He was 18 years old. He had 12 OWLs outstanding. Every examiner in his year had managed to look surprised about it. And he had been head boy, which was the sort of achievement that made people assume you would not be derailed by anything. He was also the youngest curse breaker on the Egyptian circuit by approximately 20 years. The second youngest was a witch from Stuttgart who had been doing this since before his mother was born, and she regarded him with a benevolent condescension he was working very hard to give her reason to regret. He had, however, accepted a 9-year-old from Surrey into his field camp, and he was starting to see how that might be complicating things. His mother's letter was on the table beside the survey notes. He had been saving it for breakfast. It was the most reliable part of his morning, and he picked it up and unfolded it the way you unfolded something you already knew would make you feel better and worse at the same time. She wrote about Percy first. Percy always got written about first, even in letters not addressed to Percy, because Percy in full academic preparation was a phenomenon that affected everyone nearby, whether they wanted it to or not. He was studying for something, it wasn't entirely clear what, as he'd completed his 3rd year, and there was nothing formally requiring study over summer, but whatever he'd decided needed studying was being approached with the thoroughness of someone preparing for an examination on which his soul depended. She had found color-coded revision charts in the bathroom. Then Fred and George, who had discovered that garden gnomes were susceptible to rudimentary levitation charms if you stood close enough and concentrated, and who had been conducting what she described as gnome-related chaos for the better part of a week, and who, when told to stop, had simply gotten better at not being caught. Ron was bored and had announced that what he clearly needed was an owl. Ginny had asked where Bill was twice on Monday and 3 times on Tuesday, which was an increase. She had been told he was working. She had said she knew that. Where was he working? Egypt, Molly had said. Ginny had asked if Egypt was far. It was. It was quite far. The postscript was in smaller handwriting. Your father says hello. Bill folded the letter. He looked at Harry's tent. Harry was not in Harry's tent. Harry was outside, sitting cross-legged in the patch of shade the camp produced in the half-hour before the sun moved, with Bill's ward diagrams on the ground in front of him and a charcoal stub in his hand and an expression of total concentration about. He was copying the diagrams, not tracing, copying from memory at 10 inches distance, the nested interlocking symbols that Bill had spent 3 years in applied arithmetic ward theory, learning to read, reproduced on a flat piece of tent canvas with a steadiness of hand that was frankly offensive given that he was 9. Bill watched before moving. He watched Harry set down the charcoal and study his copy, then study the original, then make a small correction. He watched Harry tilt his head the way you tilted your head at a puzzle that almost resolved. He watched Harry pick up the charcoal and add a detail at the corner of the diagram, a stabilizing mark, minor, easy to miss, and get it exactly right. Bill went to get breakfast. He brought 2 portions. "That's not how I showed you," he said, sitting down, handing over the bowl. "I know." Harry didn't look up. "There's a part here you didn't explain. I thought this was what it would be, but now I think," he pointed. Bill looked. The boy was right. "Where did you get that from? You almost drew it once." "When you were talking about the outer wall." Bill looked at the copy again and said nothing for a moment. He ate instead. Later, when the sun had moved and the shade was gone and they were back inside the tent with the survey notes between them, Bill began explaining the approach. The head-growing curse came first. It sat at the outer threshold, which was where the old Egyptian wizards always placed it, because Muggle thieves had a tendency not to get much further than the outer threshold before making poor decisions. He explained how you identified it, how you neutralized it, what you did if neutralization wasn't fully complete. Harry listened with the quality of someone who was going to remember every word and was already 3 questions ahead of the one being answered. He asked them in the right order. "What if a ward can't be neutralized?" he said. "Then we come back out," Bill said, "and I write a very long report." "What if we can't come back out?" Bill considered this. He thought about the 2 places in the survey that were wrong in ways he hadn't fully categorized. He thought about the Goblin Field Supervisor's note. "Then I write a shorter one," he said. Harry looked at him steadily. The look of someone calculating odds without drama, as though they had long since made peace with the possibility that the odds were not always good. Bill had no idea what to do with that look on a 9-year-old's face, so he turned back to the survey notes and pointed out the 3rd ward layer, and they went back to work. Evening arrived fast, as it did in the desert, and the temperature dropped with a thoroughness that always surprised Bill, as though the heat had never intended to stay. He sat with a blank parchment and his mother's letter beside him and his inkpot, and wrote. He did not mention the pyramid assignment. He wrote a sentence about the weather, and one about the camp provisions that came out sounding more like complaint than he'd intended. Then he stopped at the line about Harry and read back what he'd written. He had written, "Harry is doing well and seems comfortable, though he's still adjusting, and I think he crossed it out." He wrote, "He's been something of a minor disruption to what I had optimistically imagined would be a quiet and professionally." He crossed that out too. He wrote, "He's doing well. He asks good questions. He sent the owl." He watched it diminish against the last thin edge of sky until it was gone. Then he walked the perimeter of the camp and checked the wards on each tent, and checked the ward on Harry's tent twice, and told himself this was just professional habit, and went to bed. Harry was already dressed and outside when Bill emerged from the big tent at dawn, which was a calculated gamble. And he knew it. He had been calculating it since approximately 3 in the morning, when he had come to the conclusion that "you'll be staying at camp" was a sentence and not a wall, and that the thing about sentences was that you could stand on the other side of them and simply not acknowledge that they had been said. Bill stopped in the tent opening and looked at him. The light was the pale, early kind, grey gold, and the desert was cold in the way it was cold every morning before it decided to be the opposite. He looked in this particular light like someone who had calculated exactly the same thing Harry had, and had known exactly how it would turn out. "You're not coming," Bill said. Harry said nothing. "If something goes wrong in there, then something goes wrong," Harry said. Bill looked at him for a long time, the expression of someone annoyed at themselves for the direction their own reasoning was heading. Then he tied his hair back and said, "Right. Rules 2 paces behind at all times. Don't touch anything. If Bill says stop, stop. If he says run, run, without asking why." Harry agreed to all of them immediately, and from the slight tightening around Bill's mouth, this should have been a warning sign. But Bill picked up his kit and started walking, and Harry followed at exactly 2 paces, and they went. The sealed entry passage was cut into the base of the pyramid's eastern face, and the survey team from Prague had marked it as blocked by debris, which was an understatement. Bill pressed his hand against it and took it away fast, then pulled out his wand. "Gifodio," he said, and the stone split. Not an explosion, a seam opening, the way a crack becomes a passage if you pull at it with the right intention. The debris fell inward, and with it came the air from inside, cold, immediate, carrying the smell of time, in such concentration that Harry felt it physically against his face, as if the centuries had been packed tight. Bill lit his wand. They went in. The corridor was narrow and the stone was pale, and the dark between the lit sections was a different kind of dark than outside, older, more certain of itself. He kept 2 paces behind. The ward diagram was folded in his shirt pocket, and he was already comparing the passage's shape to the notation for entry thresholds he'd copied from Bill's notes. "First threshold is here," Bill said low-voiced. He stopped, without lifting his foot from the floor. He was pointing at a place on the corridor wall where the stone blocks were carved with a pattern that Harry recognized he had drawn it with the charcoal. 2 days ago, a little wrong at the edges. The diagram in his pocket was a better version than the one he'd drawn. The one on the wall was better than both. "Head-growing curse," Bill said. "Old one. You can tell by the way the containment symbols overlap. Here, the outer ring is a warning, but the inner one is the instruction. The instruction is wrong for you if you cross without the right counter." He was describing it in the same tone he used for the survey notes. Technical, unhurried, as if he were translating something he found interesting. "I'm going to neutralize it. Watch the outer ring. Tell me if it changes." Harry watched the outer ring. It didn't change. Bill worked at the inner inscription for approximately 4 minutes with his wand, tracing connections, murmuring things too quietly for Harry to catch entirely. Then the pattern on the stone shifted, not visibly, but in the way that something shifts when it stops pressing. Like a held breath released cross, Bill said. Harry crossed. Beyond the threshold, the corridor opened into an antechamber larger than the pyramid's outer dimensions should have permitted. Magic or mathematics or something that was both. The walls were covered not with paintings or hieroglyphs, but with notation. Line after line of inscription in a script that felt less like writing and more like a description of the world made by someone paying very close attention to things that did not usually hold still. Bill made a sound that Harry had not heard from him before. A low, involuntary exhale, the sound of a person encountering something they did not have a category for. "This isn't in the catalogue," Bill said. He was turning slowly, reading the walls. "This isn't." He stopped. He looked at the inner threshold of the chamber beyond, where the notation concentrated most densely, where the pattern was most deliberate. "It's a detecting one." Harry opened his mouth to ask what it was. Detecting. And then he noticed his scar. It had been with him his entire life, the scar. And he had learned the quality of it, the way you learned the quality of a sore tooth, present but not the point. Sometimes it was warmer than the skin around it. Sometimes, twice in his life that he could remember, it had ached briefly and gone quiet. Now it was neither of those things. It was itching, a deep, specific, structural itch that went farther than the skin. A word you couldn't remember, but that was trying to come to you. He pressed 2 fingers against it and said nothing. "Stay here," Bill said. He stepped across the inner threshold, once, twice, 3 paces. He was studying the inscription on the far wall, his wand raised, murmuring. Harry looked at the threshold. He looked at his diagram. He looked at the wall to his left, with a notation curved in a way that matched, almost exactly, the corner stabilizing mark he had added to the copy. Without knowing why, the mark that Bill had said was right, that Bill had not explained how he knew to put there. He looked at the threshold again. He crossed it. He took 1 step. That was all he managed. The ward didn't curse him. It didn't punish him. It did something altogether more impersonal. It recognized him. He felt the recognition travel through him, the way cold travels through stone, not starting from the outside, from where he was touching the air, but from the inside, from something the ward could read that no one else in the room could see. The scar went from itching to burning in the half-second, before everything happened at once. The light came from the floor, golden, old, impersonal, the color of a door closing on a source that had been shining for a very long time. It came up through the stone and reached him before he could move, and it did not hurt, but it was absolute, the way gravity is absolute, and it said no in a language older than language, and it moved him. He was not sure, afterward, if he had been thrown or simply displaced, if the ward had pushed, or if the ward had simply made it the case that he was elsewhere. The result was the same. He was in the corridor, not the antechamber, with stone against his back, and his scar burning, and every torch in the antechamber blazing the same gold simultaneously. The sound was beneath sound. A pulse, resonant, patient. It was not loud. It was the kind of thing you felt in the back of your teeth and the base of your sternum, and it did not stop. Harry. Bill was across the chamber in 4 steps, and then crouching in front of him, both hands on Harry's shoulders, reading his face with the rapid assessment of someone running through a checklist at speed. "Harry, look at me. Where does it hurt?" "My scar," Harry said. His own voice sounded like it was coming from the other side of the itch. "Anywhere else?" "No." Bill looked at the antechamber. The torches were still blazing gold. The pulse was still going. He looked at it the way you looked at something you recognized was larger than you had thought a moment ago. Then he looked at Harry, and the look was not the professional checklist look. It was the other one, the one Bill used when Harry got something right that he shouldn't have been able to get right yet, but different, sharper, edged with something that was not quite fear. "Run," Bill said. Harry ran. Bill was behind him, one hand on his shoulder to keep the pace, and they came out of the sealed corridor into the full Egyptian morning, into the enormous white light and the heat, and the pyramid sat at their backs, impassive and old, and from somewhere inside it the golden pulse continued, lower, now patient, its work accomplished. Harry sat down in the sand. The scar was cooling. Slowly, the sound was still in his teeth. He thought, something in there knew what I am. He thought, I don't know what I am. Above them, the sky was vast and absolutely indifferent, and the pyramid pulse went on for 7 minutes, and by the time it stopped, it had said what it needed to say to people Harry did not know existed in places very far away, who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of news. The scar had stopped burning, but the memory of the burn sat in it still, the way heat sits in stone, long after the sun has moved. Harry was aware of it. The way he was aware of his own heartbeat, not painful, just present, impossible to ignore once noticed. Bill had him by the shoulders, and was looking at his face with the rapid, systematic focus of someone running through a list. Eyes, tracking, speech, coherent, limbs moving. Scar, redder than it had been this morning, a raised line against the pale of Harry's forehead, which Bill noted and filed in a category he didn't have a name for yet. No curse signs anywhere else, no bleeding. Harry had been thrown against a corridor wall by the most significant ward event Bill had ever personally witnessed, and he was, by any clinical measure, uninjured. "Sit down," Bill said. "I'm fine." Bill crouched in front of him and looked at the scar again, close, careful, without touching it, and then straightened up and did what his training told him to do when something happened that you didn't have a category for. He began composing the incident report in his head. Time of entry duration inside the complex. Point of incident, inner threshold of the antechamber. Nature of reaction, ward activation, expulsion event, visual phenomenon, sustained auditory pulse detectable beyond the site perimeter. His assistant, 9 years old, uninjured, scar-reddened cause, unknown. He was still composing when the Goblin field supervisor arrived. He came at speed across the sand from the direction of the camp, his robes kicked up around his ankles, his expression doing the thing Goblin expressions did when they were furious, and expressing it through a kind of compressed efficiency rather than actual volume. He arrived and stopped 3 feet away and looked at the pyramid and then at Harry and then at Bill and said something brief and pointed in the way that goblins were brief and pointed, which meant that every word was doing very precise work, and several of them were performing the function of words Bill had been told not to say in front of children. It was an unplanned interaction between the ward system and my assistant, Bill said. The Gringotts survey didn't fully characterize the second-tier ward layer. I take responsibility for the site assessment. The supervisor stared at Harry. Harry, to his credit, looked back. The covert nature of this operation, the supervisor said, depended on the wards remaining inactive. That condition no longer exists. I understand. Bill kept his voice level. My assistant. The supervisor stared for another moment with the flat, patient quality of someone performing a calculation that was coming out the same way, no matter how many times they ran it. Then he turned back toward the camp, and the conversation was over, and Bill understood that the incident report was going to require significantly more than he had available. The representative from the local wizarding authority arrived within the hour. Bill had been expecting something official since the pyramid's pulse began. A ward event of that magnitude, detectable across a wide area, would not go unremarked. And when the robed figure came out of the shimmer of the midday heat, Bill sent Harry to sit behind the far tent and went to meet her alone. She spoke with him for 15 minutes, in low and careful tones, with the manner of someone accustomed to finding things that were not supposed to exist and assessing them without committing to a reaction. She explained what the ward system was designed to detect. The antechamber, she said, was a sentinel layer, older than the outer curses by several centuries, built by Egyptian wizards who had known that certain objects and certain kinds of dark magic left a mark that did not behave the way other magic behaved. The ward was tuned to detect the mark of death within the living, her phrase, translated from the inscription, carrying the particular precision of language that had been exact for 3,000 years. Something that died and did not die, something that carried within it a living soul, and something that belonged to the dead. She looked at the pyramid as she said this, not at Bill. She did not ask about the child. After she left, Bill sat down in the shade of the tent for a few minutes, very still, and thought about what Dumbledore had said the night he brought Harry to Privet Drive. What he had said, specifically, about the scar. He went and found Harry. "Your scar," he said, sitting down beside him in the sand. He kept his voice the same as it always was. "Has it done anything like that before? Reacted to things, to places?" Harry considered this with the gravity he brought to questions that required honesty rather than the quick answer. "It hurts sometimes," he said, "when I have nightmares. Not always. But when something feels close." Bill was very still. He had been at Hogwarts when the legend was still fresh enough to feel like news. 9 years ago was not long ago when you were 18, not when the people who had been there for it were still teaching, still keeping silence about the things they'd seen. He knew the shape of the story, the way every wizarding child knew it. The boy who survived the curse that had never been survived before, the scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt, the thing that had been done that nobody had quite explained. The thing that had been done, and why there was a scar, and not simply a body. He looked at Harry's forehead, he looked at the scar, he said, "Right." He stood up. "I need to send an owl." He wrote the letter standing at the camp table, and he wrote it quickly, because the longer he thought about what to say, the worse the letter would be. He had one sentence he needed to transmit. He wrote it. "The pyramid wards read something in Harry that I don't think was supposed to be there. I need you to come." He signed it and folded it and sealed it, and then stood for a moment with it in his hands, and then he went and found Harry, who was sitting where Bill had left him and was not looking at what Bill was carrying. "Here," Bill said. He held out the letter and the owl from its perch at the tent's edge. "You've been asking to send one." Harry took the letter and attached it to the owl with the careful, correct motion of someone who had been shown how to do it once, and remembered exactly. He held the owl up. It stepped onto his wrist, and then up to his forearm, and looked at him with the particular dignity of owls that have decided they approve. Then it spread its wings and lifted into the sky, and Harry watched it go with a stillness and attention that Bill recognized as the posture of someone who knew that whatever was in that letter was about something important and had decided not to ask. The owl disappeared into the white afternoon sky, carrying its sentence toward Scotland. That night the temperature dropped, and the desert wind came in across the sand flats, and the camp settled into the ordinary sounds of its own settling, and Bill lay awake in his tent, listening and thinking about the phrase the representative had used, the mark of death within the living and not sleeping. Far from Egypt, in a forest in Albania, where the trees grew close and the light came through in thin strips that changed the quality of the dark without eliminating it, something became aware. It was not aware, the way living things are aware. It had no eyes, no ears, no hands. It was aware the way a flame is aware of a draught, through what moved in it, through the quality of the movement, through the sudden clarifying recognition of a source, through a scar on a child's forehead in Egypt, and it had not felt this clearly in 9 years. Not since a night in late October 1981, when it had tried to kill the child and failed, and the failure had cost it everything it was, and left it this, a wraith in a dark forest, patient and furious and diminished, feeding on what it could find and waiting for the world to give it a reason to move. The world had just given it one. It went very still in the dark of the forest, and it began to think. And in England and elsewhere, people who had once made promises to it began to feel something stir at the edge of what they thought was a memory of an old obligation, and did not yet know it was something more recent than that. The owl arrived at Hogwarts shortly before midnight, and Albus Dumbledore read Bill Weasley's letter once, set it on his desk, and sat very still for a long time. The castle was nearly empty, in the way it was only empty in summer. The particular quietness of a place that had been full of noise and was now resting, its corridors holding the memory of footsteps the way stone holds warmth. Fawkes was on his perch at the window, watching Dumbledore with the bright, incurious eyes of a creature that did not worry. Dumbledore picked up the letter and read it again, though he had not forgotten a word of it. The Pyramid Wards read something in Harry that I don't think was supposed to be there. Dumbledore set it down. He looked at his hands. He had known or suspected since the night in 1981 when the impossible had happened and a curse intended to kill a child had destroyed its caster instead. He had spent 9 years building his theory carefully, piece by piece, the way you build any theory you desperately hoped was wrong, with the most stringent evidence he could find so that he could be absolutely certain before he acted on it. The theory was about Horcruxes, about Voldemort's Horcruxes specifically, and the length to which Voldemort had gone to ensure his own immortality, and the particular catastrophe of what happened when a killing curse struck the caster's own soul fragment and recoiled. The soul fragment had to go somewhere. The nearest living vessel had been a child in a cot. He had hoped the blood protection would hold until Harry was old enough. 17 at least. Old enough to understand what was in him before anyone asked him to face it. He was 9. Dumbledore rose from his chair, moved to the fireplace, and said a name. Snape arrived in 3 minutes, which meant he had not been sleeping. He entered Dumbledore's office with the particular composure of someone who had been waiting for a summons without knowing what it would be about, and had prepared themselves for most of the available possibilities. He was 30 years old and looked it in certain lights and older in others, with the dark, guarded expression of a man who had long since learned that what showed on his face was a decision, not a reflex. His robes were correct. His hands were still. Then Dumbledore handed him the letter, and his left hand moved. It was involuntary, and he stopped it almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. The hand that went toward his left forearm, where the mark that was not gone, but only dormant, had been giving him a low, persistent signal since before sundown, like a string played on an instrument in another room, like something remembered at the edge of sleep. He had not felt it this clearly since 1981, and he had spent the hours since sundown doing what he did with anything he could not immediately address. He had ignored it systematically and worked. He read the letter. His face did not change. "They'll have felt it too," he said. "The ones who are still loyal." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I know. Where is he now?" "Still in Egypt." Snape set the letter on the desk with the careful precision of a man who was doing something instead of something else. "Then he is exposed," he said. He said it without inflection, the way you stated a fact whose implications you were already well past and moving forward from. His first question had not been what happened or how or why. His first question had been where, because where was the only variable that mattered for what came next, which was keeping the boy alive, which was the only part of this that had ever mattered to him, for reasons he had never explained to anyone and did not intend to. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, with the expression that Snape found the most difficult to read and the most difficult to tolerate, the expression of someone who understood more than they were saying and was choosing to wait. "I'll go to Egypt," Dumbledore said. "I'll go with you." "Not yet. I need you here. I need to know what they know." Snape's jaw tightened once, briefly. "Then, I'll find out." He picked up his robes and left, and the door of the office closed behind him with the quiet finality of a decision made. In Otterisant Catchpole, the Weasley garden was warm and loud, and smelled of earth and the particular pungency of displaced gnomes, and Ron was losing. He had been trying to catch the gnomes since after breakfast on the reasonable grounds that it was something to do and that Fred and George had told him there was a technique, and then refused to share it, which meant he had to discover it himself. Scabbers was in his shirt pocket, which was where Scabbers usually was, a small, warm weight against his chest that occasionally twitched and occasionally didn't. He had been twitching since this morning. Not the normal kind, not the half-asleep twitch of a rodent dreaming, but an erratic, purposeful twitch, like something trying to get out. Ron grabbed a gnome by the ankle. The gnome bit him. He let go. He reached into his shirt pocket and felt Scabbers' small body, which was quivering in a way that did not feel like dreaming at all. The rat's eyes, when Ron lifted him out, were darting back and forth with a speed and focus that made something cold settle in Ron's stomach. He didn't know why. He put Scabbers back and went to catch more gnomes. His father came home early. Arthur Weasley was not usually home before 6, and the fact of him walking through the garden gate at 2:30 was the kind of thing that made the afternoon feel like a different shape than it had been 5 minutes before. He had a letter in his hand. He went straight into the kitchen without stopping, and Ron heard his mother's voice, the low version, the careful version, not the volume she used for Fred and George's catastrophes, and then the kitchen door closing. Fred and George materialized from wherever they had been with the instantaneous quality they always managed, as if they had a sense for when something worth listening to was happening. They pressed themselves each side of the kitchen door with an expression of profound scientific interest. Ron drifted over. He could hear his father saying Bill and Egypt and Dumbledore, and then something that sounded like the boy and his mother's response, which was too quiet to catch. George met Ron's eyes and mouthed something. They went to find Percy. Percy was in the sitting room with a color-coded revision schedule, and the expression of someone engaged in work of tremendous national importance, who had chosen generously to make this sacrifice on behalf of the household. Fred told him what they'd heard. Percy put down his quill. "Why?" Percy said, with the precise diction of someone whose dignity had been personally affronted. "Was I not informed?" He picked up his quill again, but now it was hovering over a different piece of parchment entirely. "I will be composing a formal inquiry." Ron went back outside. Scabbers was not twitching anymore. That was the thing. The twitching had been unnerving, but this was worse. The rat was perfectly still in Ron's pocket, with the quality of stillness that animals had when they were not resting, but arrested. Every system pointed at something Ron couldn't see or hear. Ron took him out. Scabbers' small dark eyes were fixed on nothing, focused at a point somewhere beyond the garden, beyond the hedge, beyond wherever they were. He was not afraid. He was attending to something. Ron put him back in his cage. He latched the latch. He stood there for a moment, his hand on the wire, not entirely sure why he had done it, and then he went inside for dinner and did not mention it to anyone. And the cage sat in the corner of the room, and Scabbers sat in the cage perfectly still, and the afternoon went on around him as though nothing had changed in it. Nothing had changed. That was the thing Ron wouldn't be able to explain later if anyone had asked. It wasn't that anything had happened. It was that something had moved somewhere in the invisible part of the world, and Scabbers had felt it, and Ron had felt Scabbers feel it, and neither of them had any way to say what it was. The evening came in warm and ordinary, and the letter sat on the kitchen table where Arthur had left it, and in several places across Britain that had no connection to each other and no knowledge of the others, people who had been waiting felt the waiting change quality, quietly and separately, to move. 2 days after the pyramid, the Egyptian Wizarding Authority sent 3 representatives instead of 1. And they came with documentation. Bill received them at the edge of the camp with the professional manner he had been rehearsing since 6 that morning, which was also when he had stopped sleeping and started rereading the notes Dumbledore had given him. The night he collected Harry from Privet Drive. He had been through them 4 times in the past 48 hours, looking for the thing he'd missed. He'd found it on the 3rd read. The scar is a mark from the night in question. It retains traces of that night's magic, traces. He had read the word traces and gone outside and stood in the Egyptian dark for a while. The representatives explained that the Gringotts operation was formally suspended pending investigation. He agreed to everything: to remain in camp, cooperate with the review, provide a full incident report within 72 hours. The Goblin Field Supervisor stood 3 meters away in an expression that had moved past fury into something more like grief, and said nothing, which was worse. When the representatives left, Bill stood in the sun and thought he should have asked Dumbledore more questions. He had taken the single-word traces and filed it as a detail, and moved on. He was done doing that. "Harry," he said, when he went back into the tent. Harry was sitting cross-legged on his camp bed with Bill's ward diagram notes in his lap. Though Bill suspected he had not been reading them for a while, he looked up. "The night your parents died," Bill said. He said it the way you said something you had decided to say before you could decide not to, quickly and without preamble. "The night Voldemort came for you." He watched Harry absorb the name, not with fear, with a kind of careful attention, the way you paid attention to a sound that was unfamiliar and needed identifying. Voldemort. He'd known the shape of the legend all his life, same as everyone, but the name itself was the thing people avoided, and Harry had clearly never heard it spoken aloud as simply as that. "Something happened with the curse," Bill said. "Something that left a mark, not just on your forehead." "What kind of mark?" Harry said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know enough to tell you yet." Bill met his eyes. "I'm not saying that because I don't want to tell you. I'm saying it because I genuinely don't know all of it. But what I know, I'll tell you when I know it." Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, with the particular quality of someone who had spent 9 years calibrating the difference between adults who were keeping things from you for your own good, adults who were keeping things from you for their own convenience, and adults who were telling you the actual truth about what they did and did not know. The nod meant, "I believe you." It was, Bill realized, probably the best thing Harry had given him in 2 months. He was still thinking about that when the ward perimeter signaled. It came as a sensation rather than a sound, the particular low vibration of a ward detecting approach, the way you felt it in the backs of your knees if you'd set it correctly, and were standing close enough. Bill had set his camp perimeter wards on the 2nd day in Egypt and had checked them every morning since, and he knew their quality the way he knew the quality of his own heartbeat. And what he was feeling now was not a wandering animal, and not a colleague from the Gringotts survey team, and not the Egyptian authority representatives returning for something they'd forgotten. He did not say anything. He crossed to the tent opening and looked, very carefully, at the long, flat expanse of sand between the camp and the palm scrub to the northwest. There was a figure, moving at a pace that looked unhurried but covered ground fast, the particular gait of someone who had been trained not to look like they were doing what they were doing, keeping to the scrub edge, using the shadow. 45 seconds of watching was enough for Bill to be completely certain of what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was someone who had been looking for this camp and had found it, and was not coming to negotiate. He turned back to Harry, who had been watching his face. "Hold this," Bill said, pulling the portkey from his kit. a small brass compass, worn smooth, that he'd been issued for exactly this contingency. "Hold it and don't let go of it, whatever happens." Harry took it. His hand closed around it without hesitation. "I'll tell you when," Bill said. He was scanning the perimeter, calculating distance, calculating time. The figure was 200 meters out and still coming. "Right." He put his hand over Harry's on the compass. "Now." The lurch of portkey travel was nothing like the first time. No less violent, but expected now, the world folding itself away from Egypt mid-breath and unfolding somewhere else entirely. They arrived on a cold stone floor, in a room that was small and low-ceilinged and smelled of dust and sealed air, somewhere in England, with grey light pressing thin through a single curtained window. After the Egyptian heat, the cold was immediate and total. Harry's breath misted. Bill was already on his feet, wand out, checking the room's existing wards by touch. They were there, they were intact, they were Dumbledore's work, and they held. "We're all right," Bill said. He was not certain he meant it entirely, but Harry needed to hear it, so he said it. They waited. 40 minutes later, green light bloomed in the grate that Bill had assumed was ornamental, and Dumbledore stepped out of the fireplace. He was tall, the kind of tall that seemed to decide the dimensions of whatever room he entered, and moved with the unhurried attention of someone who had arrived at a serious situation and was going to treat it that way without requiring it to be dramatic. He took in the room, the portkey still in Harry's hand, Bill's expression, and the cold. He produced 2 chairs from somewhere in his robes, and sat in the one that had already been there. "Sit down, both of you," he said. Harry sat. He looked at Dumbledore across the small, dim room with an expression that Bill recognized, having been on the receiving end of it. The expression of someone who was going to be completely honest and expected the same in return, and was prepared to notice if they didn't get it. "You came quickly," Harry said. "I was already on my way when you arrived here." Dumbledore held Harry's gaze steadily. He had the quality, in this light, of someone who had lived a very long time and had spent a significant portion of it sitting with things he wished he had handled differently. "I should have come sooner. I apologize for that, Harry." The room was quiet. Harry looked at him. Bill, watching from the edge of the scene, saw the moment it landed, the specific, visible moment, when the apology registered as a real thing and not a formality, because Harry had heard formalities and platitudes from adults his entire life. His expression didn't change much, but something in his posture did. He didn't say anything. He nodded, like he had nodded at Bill in the tent, and the silence that followed it was not hostile. It was the silence of someone who had been handed something they weren't sure what to do with and was going to take it carefully. Dumbledore turned, then, and looked at Bill. "Send word to Severus," he said. "Tell him where we are." Bill did not ask why. He already knew, in the way you knew, things you hadn't been told yet. The way that Egypt and the pyramid, and the ward's golden pulse, and the figure crossing the sand toward the camp all assembled themselves into a shape. He pulled parchment from his coat pocket and wrote 4 words, and the address, and sent it with the room's single waiting owl, and then he sat back down and looked at Dumbledore and Harry, who were looking at each other across the cold, still room, with the particular quality of 2 people who were going to have a very important conversation. All in their own way, preparing for it. Outside, England was grey and quiet. The portkey had done its work. Egypt was very far away. And somewhere in the desert they had left behind, on the sand between the camp and the palm scrub to the northwest. The figure that had been approaching stood at the site of the tents and found nothing there, and understood what nothing there meant. Dumbledore took his time, which Harry had already learned to expect. He poured himself tea from nothing or from something, Harry supposed. He was still adjusting to the fact that things could be produced from nothing, or at least from the category of things he couldn't see. And he looked at Harry over the rim of his cup with the half-moon spectacles that had a quality of not quite magnifying his eyes, but of making them more present somehow. Bright blue, those eyes. The color of something high up. You survived something that should have killed you, Dumbledore said. He said it simply, which was the most difficult way to say a thing like that, Harry thought, because simple required you to mean it without softening. The night your parents were murdered, the curse that came for you, it did not work. And when a curse of that nature does not work, it has to go somewhere. Magic always does. The piece of it that struck you, a piece of what was casting it, remained. He set down his cup. It lives in your scar. That is what the pyramid wards read. They were built to detect something that had died and had not died, something that carries within it both a living soul and something belonging to the dead. Your scar qualifies. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned the limestone from Egypt, looking for where the smooth side became rough, for where the old meaning had worn away or held. "What is it, specifically?" he said. "The thing in the scar. Explaining what you are will take more time than we have tonight." Dumbledore said it without apology, but without the dismissive quality that usually accompanied that kind of sentence from adults. It was more like, "I have a reason for this, and when it is the right time, the reason will be clear. What I can tell you is that it is a piece of very dark magic, and that it is not yours, and that it is not your fault." "I know it's not my fault," Harry said. "Good," Dumbledore said. "I wanted to be certain you knew that." Was a pause. Outside the single-curtained window, England was doing whatever England did in the early evening, grey, quiet, the distant sound of something moving on a road somewhere. Harry looked at Dumbledore, who was looking back at him, and felt the beginning of the thing that had been building since the pyramid, since the ward line, since the golden light, since the moment the ancient detection system had read him like a lock reads a wrong key and said simply, "No, you sent me to live with people who didn't want me," Harry said. Bill, sitting to his left, went very still. "The Dursleys," Dumbledore said. "You knew they didn't want me," Harry said. He had not shouted at an adult in his life. He had learned early that shouting did not produce results and usually made things worse. He was being precise. Instead, the way Bill was precise about ward diagrams, going to the exact point of the thing, not around it. "You sent me to Egypt without telling Bill what I am, whatever I am. You keep saying it will take too long to explain." He paused. "How long have you been not explaining things to me?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. His expression was, complicated was not quite the word, inhabited perhaps, the expression of a very old man sitting with a question that he had asked himself and had not answered to his own satisfaction. "A long time," Dumbledore said. "Too long." He did not elaborate. It was not, Harry felt, evasion. It was the acknowledgement of a man who understood that elaboration at this moment would be a way of turning the conversation toward himself. He left it short. Bill's hand came down briefly on Harry's shoulder. Not hard, not long, just present. He did not defend Dumbledore. He did not say anything. He left the moment to be the size it was. "The protection," Dumbledore said, when Harry had been quiet for a moment. "The magic I built from your mother's sacrifice. The enchantment that lived in the Dursley house. I must tell you about that now. He folded his hands. It required you to be able to call that house your home, not merely to live there, to genuinely call it home. He looked at Harry with the directness of someone about to confirm something they already know the answer to. You cannot do that anymore, can you? I never really could, Harry said. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. Not in surprise, in the way that you closed your eyes when something you had feared turned out to be exactly as bad as you feared, and you needed one moment to contain it before you continued. Then the protection is gone. Not because of Egypt. Egypt was not the cause. It was already failing. 9 years of circumstances that made it impossible for that house to be your home in any real sense. Egypt simply brought it to a conclusion. So there's nothing there anymore, Harry said, the thing that was keeping me safe. Not at Privet Drive. No. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. We must build something else. Several things. Starting now, Bill said. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge underneath it. Not at Harry, not at Dumbledore, exactly, but at the general situation of being in a cold English safe house, while unnamed people who had felt a pyramid pulse from 500 miles away were presumably doing something purposeful with the information. Tonight, before whoever tracked that ward signal locates us here. Yes, Dumbledore agreed. He turned to say something else, and at that moment the flue flared green in the grate, and Severus Snape stepped out of it. He came through the fireplace without urgency and stopped in the doorway with his black robes, settling around him, taking in the three of them. Dumbledore in his chair, Bill standing, Harry against the wall, with dark eyes that moved over the room with the rapid, contained assessment of someone making calculations and not showing it. His face was narrow and pale, a hooked nose, the composed expression of someone who had chosen their default expression a long time ago and kept it there. He was not, Harry noticed, surprised by anything in the room. Bill stepped between him and Harry. It was not quite a conscious movement, the kind of thing your body did before your mind had finished thinking about it. He was a step closer to Snape, and a step further from Harry, and he stayed there. Snape looked at him. The expression was, Harry had no word for it yet. It was the look of someone who had been suspected of the worst a sufficient number of times to have stopped being wounded by it. Tired, perhaps. Severus is here to help, Dumbledore said. There was something in his tone that was not quite a warning, and not quite a reassurance, both at once, addressed to both of them at once. He was a Death Eater, Bill said. I was many things, Snape said. The brevity of it did what elaboration could not have done. It did not argue, it did not explain. It simply placed the fact in the room and let it sit there, the fact that he had been something and was now something else, and that the distance between those two things was not simple, and he was not going to pretend it was. Harry stored this. He also stored the thing that happened with Snape's left arm, or rather, did not happen. Snape was not rubbing it or protecting it. He was simply holding it with a particular quality of stillness, the specific non-movement of someone being careful not to move a specific thing. Harry had watched Bill handle ward residue for 2 months. He knew the difference between incidental stillness and deliberate stillness. He said nothing about what he noticed. The room settled into a configuration that felt like the edge of something, rather than a resolution of it, Dumbledore at the table spreading parchment. Snape at the window, where the curtain gave him a narrow angle on the street below, and nothing would be able to come up the path without him knowing about it first. Bill, beside Harry, between Harry and both doors. The position of someone who had decided that his job for tonight and for the foreseeable future was to be wherever Harry was. Harry sat with his back against the wall and looked at all three of them. One had put him in a cupboard and was the origin of most of this. One had pulled him out and was the reason he knew what a ward diagram looked like. One had been something he was beginning to understand the shape of, and was here now, watching the street, apparently on the right side. For reasons he had not explained, Harry was 9 years old. He was carrying something that did not belong to him, and the three adults in this room were not entirely certain what to do about it, and none of them were going to tell him everything. He filed this next to the limestone, and the ward line's golden light, and the word traces and the cold through the scar. He would get to all of it. He was in no hurry. Outside, England was grey and still, and somewhere in it, the people looking for him had not found him yet. Harry had discovered that he could tell the difference between someone sleeping and someone pretending to sleep, because the breathing was different. Bill pretended sometimes, in Egypt, lying still and slow-breathed, while Harry moved around the camp at early morning, not wanting Harry to know he was being monitored. It was kind. Harry had found it kind rather than irritating, which surprised him slightly, because he had expected to find it irritating. Tonight, Bill was actually asleep. The breathing was the real kind, involuntary, slightly uneven, the rhythm of a body that had stopped managing itself. Harry had been awake for an hour, sitting with his back against the safe house wall, with his knees drawn up, listening to that breathing and deciding it was the first good thing that had happened in 2 days. Bill needed sleep. The past 48 hours had been the kind that ground people down in ways they didn't notice until they sat still for 30 seconds. And Bill had not sat still for 30 seconds. He should sleep. Harry was glad he was sleeping. He was still thinking this when the ward fired. It was not a sound exactly. It was the vibration he'd felt at the Egyptian camp's perimeter, the low, knee-level hum of a ward detecting approach. But this one was sharper, more compressed, set at a different frequency. He had time to register it, and then Bill was on his feet, wand out before Harry had finished registering it, and there was nothing slow or careful about it. Bill was simply upright and armed, and the sleeping person was already gone. Snape was in the corridor. Harry had no idea when Snape had slept. He was not certain Snape had slept. He was standing in the corridor doorway with his wand in his hand and his black robes around him, and an expression of focused attention that made him look, in the half-dark, like a person performing a calculation. 3 at least, Snape said, without looking at Bill. More, Bill said. He was at the window. 5. Stay there, Snape said to Harry. It was not unkind. It was the tone of someone stating a constraint that was not negotiable, the way a physical law was not negotiable. Against the inside wall, do not try to help. Harry pressed himself against the inside wall. He was not, he noted, internally afraid, in the way he might have expected. He was afraid the way he had been afraid in the pyramid, not of dying, specifically, but of not understanding what was happening, which was a more useful kind of afraid, because it kept him paying attention. He agreed to staying against the wall with considerably more sincerity than he had agreed to staying at camp. The front of the safe house came apart. He heard it, a cracking, structural sound, the sound of protective wards being pushed through by something that had enough force and enough intent to do so. And then Bill was at the door, and his voice was sharp and precise, and he said, "Defodio." The ground in front of the entrance, folding in on itself in a long gouge that opened between the attackers and the door. The spell was not the same as the pyramid entry. The motion was the same, the intention was the same, but what it ruptured was different, and what it created was a barrier rather than a passage, and the effect was total. 2 of the approaching figures went down immediately, not all of them. Snape was in the doorway now. Harry heard stupefy twice in quick succession, clean and fast, aimed with the efficiency of someone who did not waste motion. Heard Expelliarmus once, a figure's wand spinning away, clattering. 3 down, still more. The numbers Bill had said were wrong, and the 3 of them had known it, and knowing it had not fixed it. One of the attackers, a robed figure, face obscured, moving with the trained, purposeful speed of someone who had practiced exactly this, got past the ground barrier, got past Snape, got through the door. Harry's scar lit up like a struck match. It was the worst since the pyramid. Worse than the pyramid. The pyramid had been impersonal, the ward reading him, recognizing him, broadcasting a fact about what he was. This was directed. The burning went deep and sideways at once behind his eyes and into the base of his skull, and through it. Not a voice, not a vision, but a sensation. Something opened. Something vast. Something cold in the way that the absence of anything warm is cold, the cold of a thing that had been stripped of everything that connected it to the living world, except one very thin thread. And that thread was attached to the scar on his forehead, and it pressed through that thread. Harry felt it the way you felt something reaching into your chest from the outside. Something that knew exactly where he was, something ancient and hungry, and very, very awake. He pushed back. It was not a spell. He had no wand. He had no incantation, no training, no technique. He had 9 years of being told to be small and quiet and out of the way, and he had 2 months of Egypt, and he had the cold thing pressing through his scar. Whatever came out of him had no name and no color, and left the room white for half a second, and the attacker, who had been 4 feet away and moving toward him, was no longer 4 feet away. He was on the far side of the room. The wall behind him had a new shape. The room went quiet. Outside, the sound of a ward being reasserted. Snape's voice, sharp and clipped. Then nothing. Bill was in the doorway, face set, assessing the room's new configuration, and then he crossed it in 4 steps and crouched in front of Harry with both hands on his shoulders and did the physical check, eyes breathing, any curse signs, any damage, in the rapid, systematic way he always did it. And Harry cooperated with this because he understood by now that it needed to happen before anything else could happen. "I'm not hurt," Harry said. "I can see that." Bill's voice was even. He looked at Harry very carefully. "Not at the scar," at Harry. "You threw him through a wall. I didn't mean to." "I know." Bill did not look surprised. He looked like someone having a feeling they had prepared themselves for, and found more complicated than the preparation accounted for. "What happened?" "I felt something," Harry said. "Through the scar. Something cold." He paused, naming it correctly. "Mattered. Not Voldemort, something of him, something that knows exactly where I am." Bill was holding him by both shoulders, and looking at him with the steadiness that Harry had come to understand, meant Bill was working very hard to convey something. "It can't reach you," Bill said. "It is not here, and it cannot reach you." Harry looked at him. He did not say it was here, in a way. He did not say it reached me, in a way. And I pushed it back, and I'm not entirely certain I can always do that. He did not say any of this, because Bill believed what he was saying, and because Harry was 9 years old, and because the filing system in the back of his mind, where he kept the things he was going to think about later, was already opening, and the cold was going into it, neatly, alongside the pyramid light, and the word traces, and Snape's careful forearm, and the sound of Bill's real sleeping breath. He nodded. Dumbledore was suddenly in the room. Harry had not heard him come in, not through the fight, not through any of it, which was either because Dumbledore moved very quietly or because everything else had been louder. He was moving quickly. Harry had not seen him move quickly before. He was gathering parchment, and his robes were in motion, and his face had the expression of someone who had made several decisions in the past 4 minutes and was now acting on all of them simultaneously. Watching Dumbledore move quickly was, Harry found, more frightening than the people who had been outside. "We're leaving," Dumbledore said. He did not say it to anyone in particular. He said it to the room, which was a different thing entirely and somehow more final. Harry got up. He picked up the limestone from Egypt, which had been in his pocket through all of it and was still there. He held it in his fist, rough side and smooth side, 3,000 years of certainty, and followed Bill toward the door. By December the days were short and the burrow was loud, and Harry had been there 3 weeks and was still adjusting to both. He had turned 10 in July, at a warded location in the north of Scotland that Bill had arranged, which was comfortable and quiet and had good light, and Bill had produced a cake which Harry had not known how to react to and had subsequently eaten in its entirety over the course of 2 days, while pretending it was a practical matter of caloric management. Then there had been 2 more locations after that, each warded, each temporary, and then in late November, Bill had said, "We're going to my parents for a while." Harry had said nothing to indicate this was not a perfectly ordinary sentence, even though it was the most alarming sentence he'd heard since Dumbledore's explanation about what lived in his scar. The burrow was not a thing you could prepare for. You turned off the lane, and it was there, a house that appeared to have been added to incrementally by someone whose architectural philosophy was, if a thing can be attached, attach it, and if it stays up, it was correct to attach it. It was tall in an impossible way, crooked in a way that seemed structural rather than accidental, and it was lit from every window. Harry stood in the entrance for a long time, not because he was uncertain. He was not uncertain exactly. He was memorizing. The smell of cooking, which was not the institutional smell of a school canteen, or the careful smell of Petunia's kitchen, but something made with genuine enthusiasm for the project. The noise, which was plural and layered and seemed to come from multiple floors simultaneously. The light, which spilled out of every window at once and turned the frosted grass of the garden gold. He went in before anyone noticed him standing there. He was beginning to understand that the right time to go in was before things changed. He met Ron on the stairs. Ron was carrying a chess piece, a knight, heavy white stone, and was coming down as Harry was going up, and they stopped on the same step and looked at each other. Ron looked at him the way Harry had come to recognize as the look of someone sizing up a chess position, taking inventory of everything before committing to a move. He had red hair and freckles and blue eyes that were assessing rather than hostile. "You're the one who was in Egypt," Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. "Bill writes about you in his letters. What does he say?" Ron considered this. "That you ask good questions." He shifted the chess knight to his other hand. "What do you ask about?" They were still on the stairs 20 minutes later, which was how Percy found them, and about which Percy had feelings. Percy was 14 and wore spectacles and had the quality of someone who had prepared a formal welcome and was discovering it could not be deployed in the current circumstances. "But he said I was going to introduce everyone properly at dinner," Harry said. "That sounds good." He said it very politely and then turned back to Ron, and Percy stood on the stairs for a moment with his prepared introduction, and then went back upstairs to write something down, which was apparently a coping mechanism. Fred and George had, by the time Harry came down for dinner, decided he was a testing ground. They presented jokes in sequence with the systematic focus of scientists conducting trials. Harry laughed. He did not laugh at 3 others, not because he didn't find them funny, but because he was watching the methodology, and the methodology was genuinely interesting. Fred noticed this and told George, and George told Fred, and they exchanged the particular look of identical twins who have not needed words for so long that words would be redundant, and Harry was elevated to the category. Ginny watched from doorways. She was 9 now, small and red-haired with bright brown eyes that took in a great deal without giving much back, and she watched Harry from doorways for 3 days with the focused patience of someone conducting a separate and private assessment. On the 4th day she was in the garden when he went out to look at the frost on the gnome holes, and she said, without preamble, "What does Egypt smell like?" Harry thought about it honestly. "Dust," he said, "and sometimes something older, like a locked room that nobody has been in for a very long time." Ginny looked at this information for a moment. Then she nodded, as though it confirmed something she'd already suspected, and went back inside. After that, she occasionally sat in the same room as Harry without saying anything, which he understood to be a different and more comfortable kind of watching. Snape came in the 2nd week. He arrived through the fireplace on a Tuesday afternoon in the particular way that made the whole house rearrange itself slightly, not physically, but atmospherically, the way a temperature change reorganized a room without moving anything in it. He and Dumbledore withdrew to the kitchen, and the rest of the household managed their awareness of this with the controlled composure of people who had been briefed on necessity and were choosing to find it adequate. Bill stayed near Harry without making it obvious he was staying near Harry. Arthur Weasley sat by the wireless with the particular careful attention of someone listening to something other than the wireless. Harry went out to the garden. He was crouching by the garden wall, looking at the frost patterns on the stone when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Snape was in the doorway. He had come out alone, for reasons he did not explain, and was looking at Harry with the particular intensity Harry had by now catalogued as Snape's default. But there was something in it tonight that was different. It was the look of someone who was not, in fact, looking at Harry, who was looking at something that Harry was in the position of, in the way that a painting sometimes reminded you of something else, and you couldn't see the painting anymore, only the thing it reminded you of. Harry stayed very still. It was exactly 40 seconds. Then Snape turned and went back inside without having said a word. Harry crouched by the wall and thought, whatever that is. He filed it beside Snape's careful forearm, and the way Snape had fought at the safe house without being asked to explain himself. He found the newspaper cutting 3 days later in the inside pocket of his own coat. He must have picked it up at one of the warded locations and forgotten it. It was a short article about Azkaban, which was a prison and the prisoners in it, and there was a name he recognized because Bill had said it once in passing, and he had filed it Sirius Black. He brought the cutting to Bill. Bill read it. He sat down. Then he said, "Your godfather." Harry had not known he had a godfather. He sat down too. Bill told him what he knew, which was not everything, and which Bill was careful to say was not everything. Sirius Black had been his parents' best friend. He had been imprisoned in Azkaban since 1981, after the night Harry's parents died, accused of murders. Whether he had committed them was... Bill paused, and the pause meant the honest answer was complicated, not something Bill was certain of. "I can't tell you he's innocent," Bill said. Harry looked at the cutting. "Is there someone called Remus Lupin?" he said. He had found the name in another place, a letter of his father's preserved, which Dumbledore had given him at the safe house. He had not mentioned it until now. Bill's expression shifted into the territory of things that were true and difficult. "He was a friend of your father's," he said. "He's not doing well these days. He has difficulties that make it hard for him to hold work. He's somewhere in England. He's alive. He said this last part the way you said things that were both facts and reassurances, the two jobs performed by the same sentence. Harry folded the newspaper cutting and put it in his pocket with the limestone from Egypt. Two pieces of a world he was only beginning to map. More pieces kept appearing. He was beginning to understand that the map was much larger than he had been given credit for, that there were people connected to him, places connected to him, a history connected to him, most of which had been withheld, and that the withholding was not malicious, but it was also not finished. Downstairs, the Weasley household was loud with dinner, and the smell of something with onions, and the particular soundtrack of a family that had been a family for a long time, and had room in it, apparently, for one more. Harry sat on the edge of his borrowed bed in the room Bill had been given, and listened to it for a while before going down. He was 10 years old. He was beginning, carefully, to believe this might be somewhere he could stay. Harry was not asleep. He had learned at Privet Drive to be still in a way that looked like sleep but was not. The particular controlled breathing and motionlessness that caused adults to stop checking. He had used this technique at the top of the stairs for 4 minutes before the kitchen voices resolved into words, and for another 3 minutes after, because the words required time to assemble into meaning. Dumbledore was speaking in the low, unhurried way that Harry now recognized as the register he used for things he had been thinking about for a long time and was now saying for the first time out loud. Bill's responses were shorter and more controlled than his usual voice, which meant Bill was doing the thing he did when something alarmed him, and he was choosing not to show it, which was the opposite of reassuring. The Death Eater remnants, Dumbledore said, were not stopping. The signal from the pyramid had been too clear, too broad. They knew Harry was in Britain. They knew the blood protection was gone. The address at Privet Drive meant nothing anymore, could not be used as a shield or a decoy, and they were organized in the way that people who have been waiting 9 years for something become organized when that something finally arrives. They were not going to stop. "We have 2 options," Dumbledore said. Bill said, "Tell me the second one first." There was a pause. "The second option is that Harry remains under my ward work and your protection until September of next year. He cannot begin at Hogwarts before then. He will turn 11 in July, and the term begins in September, and there is no mechanism in the school's enrollment to accommodate earlier. Hogwarts is the safest place in Britain for him. Until then, we manage. And the first option," Bill said, "Harry returns to the Dursley household. Immediately, he re-establishes genuine residency, calls it home, in the real and felt sense, not merely the administrative one. If he can do that, the blood protection may reconstitute. It was not destroyed. It simply stopped finding purchase. If he could genuinely call it home again, it could rebuild." Silence. Then Bill said carefully, "And could he genuinely call it home? Even what the Dursleys are." Another pause. Longer. "That," Dumbledore said, "is the difficulty." Harry sat at the top of the stairs and thought about the word home and how it fit in his mouth, and thought about the smell of the Burrow kitchen and the noise of the household and the limestone from Egypt in his coat pocket and the quality of light. He thought about 7 years in a cupboard. He thought about what it would mean to try, sincerely and without reservation, to call that house his home. He thought, in the Albanian forest, in dark that had been undisturbed long enough to have its own weight, the thing that had once been a man was present the way cold was present in a sealed room. Without source, without direction, filling the available space. It sustained itself on what it could find. It did not think in the way living things thought. It knew. Tonight, it knew more than usual. Somewhere across Europe a child was dreaming, and through dreams the Scarlink was at its clearest, and what came through had the quality of an open door. The protection that had masked the boy's location for 9 years was gone. The boy was in Britain. The boy was findable. The Wraith held this knowledge the way stone holds heat. It could not act, not yet, not without something to inhabit. But the quality of its awareness had shifted from passive to directional. In the way that a thing with no voice could be said to have made a decision, it had made one. Harry came down the stairs. He had put on his shoes, which he felt was a detail that demonstrated seriousness of purpose. He walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Dumbledore and Bill looked at him, Bill with the particular expression of someone who had known this was a possibility and had not prepared for it adequately regardless. Dumbledore with something that might have been, if Harry was reading it correctly, a very restrained version of unsurprised. "I'm not going back," Harry said. Neither of them said anything immediately. "I understand that you want me to." He kept his voice the way Bill had kept his voice, even, deliberate, doing more work than its volume suggested. "If I go back, I'll call it home. I'll mean it because I'll make myself mean it, because that's what the magic requires. And I know how to do that. I've done it before, more or less, because a cupboard is a home if it's the only one you have. The protection will work again, and I will spend the next 7 years trying to forget everything I know about what's actually out here." He paused. "And when I get to Hogwarts, I'll be behind everyone who didn't know what I know. And the thing in my scar will still be there. None of it will have changed. It'll just be harder to see." Dumbledore looked at him for a very long time. In the silence, the burrow made the sounds. It always made, late at night, the settling of old wood, the particular creak of the third stair, the distant domestic noises of a house that had more people in it than it had technically been designed for. Harry waited. "What do you know?" Dumbledore said finally, quietly. "About the thing in your scar?" Harry thought about the pyramid light and the cold, through the Scarlink and the word traces and Dumbledore's careful and systematic withholding. He thought about what the ward had read, the phrase the Egyptian representative had used, the shape of what had been explained to him and the shape of what had been deliberately left out. "That it doesn't belong to me," Harry said. "And that whoever it does belong to knows I'm here." The kitchen was very still. Dumbledore's expression had the quality of someone encountering a fact they had hoped would take longer to arrive. He looked at Bill. Bill looked at Dumbledore. Harry waited. "No," Dumbledore said. "You are not going back." The decision, once said, settled into the room with the solidity of something that had always been going to be true and had simply been waiting for the right moment. Dumbledore outlined what it would look like, ward work, layered over every location Bill and Harry occupied, Dumbledore's own, replacing what Lily had built as best as anything could replace it. It would not be as certain. It would not be as elegant. Nothing built in months was the same as something built in love and death and sacrifice over years. But it would be real, and it would hold. And it would hold, because Bill had agreed to stay. "This is a terrible idea," said Snape from the doorway. He had arrived. Harry was not sure exactly when, which was a habit of Snape's, that Harry was beginning to find less surprising and more simply characteristic. He was in his coat and his traveling robes, and he had the expression of someone who had been on his way here for some time and had arrived to find exactly what he had anticipated. Dumbledore looked at him with the calm of someone who had expected this comment. "Most good ones are," Dumbledore said. Snape's expression did not change appreciably. He stepped into the kitchen and sat down, Not at the table with Harry, but in the chair by the window, which was the position he seemed to prefer in any room that had a window, and an outside he could monitor. He said nothing further. Harry understood, after a moment, that Snape's saying it was a terrible idea was not the same as Snape refusing to be part of it, and that in Snape's own system of communication. Later, after Dumbledore had gone, Harry sat in the kitchen alone, lights low, the burrow settled around him. His scar was quiet tonight, not the suppressed quiet of something held back, genuinely quiet, resting. He put 2 fingers to it and felt nothing unusual. Just the skin, just the lightning bolt that had been there since before he could remember. He thought about the pyramid light and the cold through the scar and the adult's careful words arranged around the one they didn't use. He could feel the shape of what he was carrying, a piece of something's soul, anchored in a living person, surviving the death of its origin by finding a vessel before the vessel could die. He didn't know the word for it yet. The word would come. The shape was already there. Somewhere in Albania, something was in the dark between trees, and it knew he was here, and he knew it knew. Not a mystery, an impasse, a thing that had to be resolved and could not be resolved. Yet he had been waiting his whole life without knowing what for. Now he knew that was something. Late January in the burrow was cold, in the particular way of houses that had more charm than insulation, and the kitchen was the warmest room and everyone knew it, which was why everyone ended up there. Harry was at the table with a book on magical theory that Bill had annotated in the margins, in his increasingly familiar handwriting, the handwriting that started neat and got more emphatic as interest increased. He was reading a chapter on ward detection that Bill had marked with 3 stars and the comment, "extremely relevant." Ron was across the table doing arithmetic, and they had, over the past 2 months, established the comfortable working silence of people who studied better in company than alone. Scabbers was in his cage in the corner. Ron had not said anything about this, but Harry had noticed over the past 3 days that Ron's eyes went to the cage with an attention that was not the attention of someone checking on a sleeping rat. He was reading the section on threshold detection, the principle that a ward which detected approach rather than contact required calibration to distinguish between authorized visitors and threats, and that miscalibration was the most common source of field incidents. Which was the polite term the book used for things going badly wrong when the ward fired. He felt it before he heard it, which was a thing he had not been able to do in Egypt, which told him that 2 months of living inside Dumbledore's ward work had changed the calibration of his own attention. The perimeter ward fired, and at the same moment the kitchen window came in. Not broke came in, the distinction being that something struck it with the specific force of magical impact rather than physical momentum, and the glass went inward in a pattern that was not random but concentrated. Bill was on his feet before the sound had finished, which was a thing Harry had stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for. "Ron," Bill said, "upstairs. Take Ginny." Ron looked at him. Then he picked up Scabbers' cage in the motion of someone who has made a decision and is executing it cleanly, not fumbling, and went, and the stairs creaked under him, and then the creaking was gone, and Harry and Bill were in the kitchen, and the window was open to January in a way. "Harry! I know!" Harry moved to the inner wall, not upstairs. That had never been the agreement. The inner wall, away from the windows, away from the doors, with sight lines to both. He pressed his back against it and watched Bill turn to the door, and his entire manner change from the careful, managed version of himself that he kept for ordinary hours to the version that had opened the pyramid and read the survey notes and survived the safe house. The version that was very good at this, Bill said "Defodio," and the garden shed went. Not the whole shed. Part of the back wall and the roof overhang, dropping in a controlled collapse onto the approach path, creating a 4-foot rise of rubble and timber, and the contents of the shed that were now also rubble. He was faster than he had been in Egypt. Harry noticed this even now, because noticing things was the response pattern he had always defaulted to when he was afraid, and there was nothing he could do. Bill was faster, and his angle was better, and the spell's effect was larger, and there were still too many of them. Snape was in the kitchen doorway. He fought from the doorway with the particular economy of someone for whom this was not unfamiliar. Stupefy twice in rapid succession. Expelliarmus, for the figure trying to get around the rubble on the eastern side. Stupefy again. Harry watched his face, because he had been watching Snape's face when Snape was not watching him for 6 months. Snape was not afraid. He was concentrating with the quality of attention that fear would have disturbed, and had not disturbed. His body had learned certain responses so thoroughly they had become faster than decision. One of them got past the rubble. Harry saw it happen in the half-second before Snape did. Saw the figure use the distraction Bill had created on the eastern approach to come through the gap to the west, which was the smarter approach, and which meant whoever they were paying attention. The figure was moving toward the inner wall. Toward Harry, Snape turned. He fired 3 spells without pause. The first deflected, the second grazed, the third connected, and the figure went down hard across the kitchen tiles 4.5 feet from where Harry was standing. And the silence that fell in the immediate aftermath of that specific impact was the particular silence of something that had been coming very fast and was now not moving at all. Snape looked at Harry. Half a second, not more. His expression did not change. Then he turned back to the doorway. Harry thought, he wasn't checking whether I was afraid. He was checking whether I was still there. There is a difference, and he had just seen it. Then the second wave arrived, and he stopped thinking and started watching. There were more of them than there should have been, more than the safe house, more coordinated, the largest thing they had attempted since the signal had gone out 7 months ago. Bill was managing the east approach and the northern perimeter simultaneously, which was too many things. And even as Harry watched, Bill caught something on the shoulder, a glancing hit from whatever spell someone had fired over the rubble barrier, and went down on one knee. He was back up in 2 seconds, one still moving, but he was slower now, and his left arm was doing less work, and Snape was managing 2 approaches from the doorway, and Harry could see very clearly what the arithmetic produced if you ran it to its conclusion. He thought about Ron going upstairs without complaint, which was not the default Ron behavior, and meant Ron had understood that Harry needed him to. He thought about Ginny asking what Egypt smelled like, and receiving the answer with complete seriousness. He thought about Bill making tea, reading ward diagrams, checking Harry's tent twice. The accumulated weight of 7 months, the first 7 months of his life, that had contained anything he wanted to keep. What came out of him was not the same thing that had come out at the safe house. The safe house had been a push, a recoil. This was not a recoil. It was not force in any directed sense, not a spell, not something he chose. It came from the same place. Heat came from radiating outward, not aimed at anything, simply present and incompatible with what approached it. The 3 remaining figures did not go backward. They went still, and then they went away, retreating from something their training had not given them a response to. The garden was quiet. The kitchen was quiet. The cold came in through the window. Bill crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and sat down on the floor, pulling Harry down with him. and they sat against the inner wall with their backs to the plaster, and the January morning outside, and the rubble and the scattered evidence of what had just happened, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Harry's scar opened, not with pain, not the burning of the pyramid or the safe house, the quiet version, the scar link at its clearest, the adrenaline cleared and everything still and nothing between him. He felt the forest in Albania. He felt the cold and patient weight of something aware of him. He felt it feel him. And he felt, through the link, not in words, but in information, the way cold water carries information about temperature, that it knew what had just happened here, that it was not afraid of it, that it was something else, that it had a great deal of time. His jaw locked. He was aware of this distantly, aware that he was staring at a fixed point and that Bill had noticed. Bill put both arms around him and held on, which was, against all odds, exactly the right response. When it passed the way the pyramid's pulse had passed fully, and leaving something behind in the quality of the quiet. "He knows where I am," Harry said. His voice came out normal, which surprised him. "Yeah," Bill said, "I know." There was a pause. "We'll worry about that tomorrow." "Okay," he said. Dumbledore arrived 40 minutes later. He walked through the burrow with the attention of someone conducting an assessment. The rubble, the window, the figures on the ground, the shed. And then he looked at Harry, still on the floor, with Bill's arm across his shoulders. Dumbledore's expression was careful and complicated in the way it always was when it involved Harry specifically. He said, very quietly to himself, "The power, the Dark Lord knows not." Harry heard it. He filed it beside everything else he was keeping careful track of, all the shapes he didn't yet have names for. He would get to it. He had a great deal of time. July 31st was a Thursday that year, and Harry turned 11 at 7 in the morning by the Burrow's kitchen clock, the one that tracked where everyone was, rather than what time it was, and which had, sometime in the past week, acquired a hand with his name on it. He had not mentioned this. He did not know what to do about it yet, except to note it, the way he noted things that mattered and required more thinking than he had time for in the moment. Bill had made a cake. It was on the kitchen table when Harry came downstairs, recognizably a cake, with 11 candles in a pattern that was not quite symmetrical, because Bill's spatial reasoning was exceptional in three-dimensional field contexts. It had been there long enough that the wax had made decisions of its own. Bill was at the counter with his tea, looking at it the way he looked at things that had not quite gone to plan, and were nonetheless finished and present. The Weasley household accumulated around it in the way of families who did not need an occasion to be in the same room. Molly was at the stove with considerable commitment. Arthur had the prophet in his lap and was not reading it. Ron was at the table with a chess piece. He had apparently carried down from upstairs through some automatic mourning process. Fred and George were in the doorway, conducting an argument that was collaborative rather than actually disagreeable. Percy was by the window reading something with determined concentration and periodic involuntary glances toward the table. Ginny was the one who said happy birthday. She said it simply, without ceremony, and then sat down beside Ron and reached for the toast, as though a thing stated didn't need to be elaborated on. Harry looked at the 11 candles, at all of them, at the particular accumulation of a family that had made room without making a performance of it. He thought, as precisely as he could, this is what it was supposed to be like. The shape of it had been there for a long time, the knowledge that somewhere this existed, warm and loud and slightly haphazard, and he had simply not been inside it before now. Bill cut the cake. It was, Harry noted privately, extremely good for something that had looked so uncertain. He ate 2 pieces and did not say this, and Bill pretended not to notice, which was how they handled most things. The owl came in the later morning with the authority of ministry post, rather than ordinary correspondence, more deliberate, more certain that acceptance was not in question. It dropped a thick cream envelope in front of Harry and departed without waiting for acknowledgement. The envelope was addressed in emerald ink, Mr. H. Potter, The Borough, Ottery St. Catchpole, Devon. Harry opened it. He read it twice, the invitation, the supply list, the train information. September the 1st, King's Cross Station, platform 9 3/4, 11 o'clock. He set it on the table. Ron, across from him. Harry, we're going to Hogwarts. Ron. Yeah, the tone of someone for whom this was settled, which it had been. There was something that was the exact opposite of surprise, the arrival of a thing in exactly the form it had been described, fitting into the space that had been waiting for it. Bill read the letter when Harry passed it to him. He stood at the counter and read it twice with the expression of someone receiving information that was also, in some way, a conclusion. His face did something private. He folded it and handed it back. He had been Harry's teacher for 13 months, not formally, not with lesson plans or examinations, but in the way that things learned by doing lodged differently than things learned by instruction. Harry was arriving at Hogwarts, already knowing what a ward line was, already knowing what Defodio did and what it felt like to use under pressure, already knowing that his scar was a marker for something he didn't yet have the word for. He was arriving for the first time in any version of his life, prepared. "You'll be fine," Bill said. "I know." Harry paused a moment. "I learned from someone who was head boy and got 12 outstanding OW. "Too late," Bill laughed. The real version not managed. Harry filed it with the other real ones. Hagrid did not come. In some other version of events he would have arrived wherever Harry was with the personal force of someone who had been waiting 10 years to be the person who finally told Harry Potter who he was. In this version, Dumbledore had sent a letter to Bill, formal, administrative, confirming Harry's Hogwarts enrollment, and the end of the Gringotts arrangement. Bill had shown Harry the relevant paragraphs. Diagon Alley was not a surprise. Harry walked through it the way he walked through everything, now collecting information, noting the architecture of a place designed by people who had always known magic was real. He knew what Gringotts looked like from the outside because he had been in one of their field camps. He went to the bookshop and the robe maker and the apothecary. And he went to Ollivander's last. The shop was quiet in the manner of places with a long relationship with their own silence. The wandmaker looked at Harry with pale, wide eyes that moved over him with the focused attention of someone reading a signature. And Harry looked back with the steady patience of a child who had spent a year learning that some assessments required time. They tried several wands. Harry held each one and waited, understanding that he was not waiting for approval but for recognition, the difference between a ward that accepted passage and one that simply hadn't refused it yet. Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches supple. It found him the way the pyramid ward had found him, with recognition rather than ceremony. Warmth came through his hand and ran to his shoulder, and the wandmaker nodded once with the expression of someone confirming what they had expected. The barrier at King's Cross was the kind of thing Bill had told him that you walked through if you believed you could. Harry walked through it without hesitating. Platform 9 3/4 was loud and smoke-thick and managed chaos. Percy, 15, and a prefect had gone through already. Fred and George were causing difficulty with a luggage trolley. Ron managed his trunk with the resigned competence of someone who had developed opinions about this. Ginny stood beside her mother and watched Harry come through the barrier with the same careful attention she had been directing at him since December. Harry and Bill had a moment at the edge of the platform. It was not long. "Right," Bill said. "Every week, if you get in trouble, I'll handle it." Bill looked at him. "That's exactly what I'm worried about." Harry grinned. It was the grin of a child who had been inside a pyramid and survived 2 safe house attacks and looked a wraith in the face through a scar and refused to return to a cupboard under the stairs, and who was now on his way to the rest of his life. He went to the train. The compartment he found was empty. He sat down and watched the platform through the window, watching nothing in particular. The train had the smell of old upholstery and something else, the slight alteration in the air that all magical objects had once you knew what to look for. The door opened. Ron stood in it with a rat on his shoulder, and an expression of resigned hopefulness, the look of someone who had checked several compartments already and was trying not to make that obvious. "Can I sit here?" "Everywhere else is." "Come in," Harry said. Ron sat down. Scabbers settled on Ron's knee and regarded Harry with small, bright eyes. Harry looked at the rat. Something in him registered it, the way the pyramid ward had registered him, a faint wrongness that wasn't yet a shape, the edge of a pattern he hadn't completed. He looked away. He had learned, this year, the difference between a thing that needed immediate attention and a thing that was prepared to wait. The train began to move. Harry watched England going past the window, green and grey and specific, the country opening out as London fell away, and the outskirts thinned, and the fields came. He thought about his godfather in Azkaban, who might be innocent. He thought about the wraith in Albania, gathering itself back together in the dark. He thought about the scar and what it carried, and the shape of the word that hadn't arrived yet. He thought about 12 months of curse-breaking theory and notebooks full of ward diagrams and the limestone from Egypt in his coat pocket, rough side and smooth, 3,000 years of certainty and a year of knowing what it felt like to be wanted in a room. He did not know what Hogwarts would ask of him. He did not know what the war would ask of him. He was not afraid of either. He'd been in a pyramid